Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, where it is actually fall. Nice. So when you think about the convergence of those two rivers, the Raccoon, the Des Moines, imagine leaves, not trash, Bud, leaves floating down them, and you will understand the pumpkin spice weather that we're now actually experiencing. Bud, good to have you on the show. You know who I bet also likes fall, I'm guessing?
Who's that?
Imogene Ingredients.
Oh, for sure.
Don't you think cattle get hungrier about now? Well, I mean, I'm getting hungrier.
It's also harvest time, which is a very Imogene time of year. I mean, agriculture. It's,
oh, you mean in general? I was like, wait, do we get beef? Okay.
That's their tagline, harvest time. No, it's harvest. It's harvest time.
It's harvest time, bro. Any rate, what we want to say is thank you to Imogene Ingredients for underwriting our show. Good guys, good weather. We're all happy to be here. Bud, we are in for a treat. We're going to be listening. We're going to be speaking with Leah Libresco Sargeant, her new book, The Dignity of Dependence, A Feminist Manifesto. She has been beyond awesome ever since she's converted. She's had wonderful books, but I got to say, I think this is her magnus opus so far.
I know you occasionally visit South Bend, Indiana. Do you know, like, the Notre Dame press folks, or is that a different circle of people?
I mean, I run into some of them. They've changed over the years, but all I got to say is
this was a good get.
Yeah, when they were breaking down the door to make sure to get this one, they were smart cookies. And so it's out this month, and we get a chance to talk to her. So very happy about that. We'll be doing that here very quick. One more time, it's Leah Libresco Sargeant, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, we're glad to have you with us. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for making the show possible. We appreciate it. 9 years on Iowa Catholic Radio. Glad to keep trucking along. Today on the show, we have a very special guest, Leah Libresco Sargeant. Her new book is The Dignity of Dependence. She's an author, public intellectual, policy analyst. She's written for First Things America, The American Conservative, and runs the popular substack, Other Feminisms. Leah, thank you for coming on The Uncommon Good.
Thank you for having me.
Now, to embarrass you a bit real quick, I was talking to another Leah Sneed, and we were calling you the Miles Davis of Catholic speakers because you're so cool and collected. You do such a good job of getting the good ideas that you're working on out there where people can interact with them, like on the Substack. But I have to tell a little biography. The first chapter of this book, which the whole book is absolutely wonderful, but if you had to make me say which one should everyone absolutely have to be read by force of law, The World is the Wrong Shape for Women, is an amazing chapter. And I got to see you give, I would say, the proto version of that at the ethics conference at Notre Dame a few years ago. It was spellbinding. The entire room was completely focused in because what you were talking about was so important. But this is actually how it relates to the argument of the book. This argument is that women, particularly because of constraints of how the world has been made, often find themselves not comfortable in their own skin. You yourself do such a great job of this, but I think it's actually your pursuit of figuring out how to do that, to be an embodied person, to me, that undergirds what brought you to this point. Do you feel that that is something that you've carried through in your intellectual concerns? Is this idea about how am I an enfleshed person comported in the world, and how do I talk to the world about how it is that we owe it to each other to think about how others are able to find themselves in the world?
Well, I think that challenge of what does it mean to be an embodied person, for this to be as core to who I am as being a thinking person, a reasoning person, was a big challenge for me in becoming a Christian. I had, before converting, had defaulted to a little bit of the idea of, well, my body is a kind of semi-functional mech suit for my mind. And part of becoming a Christian was trying to wrestle with the idea of God didn't just give me my body to move around or put my will into practice. He gave me my body because it is me and because it's something he really wants humans to know about ourselves in relation to him that can only be expressed through being embodied. And that is a challenge for me. It's something I've hopefully come a long way with. And here, what I really want to sit with in the book is the idea that our weak and fallible bodies are a way we ultimately connect to each other in love. It's not a problem we're trying to transcend. It's not that much of our life is spent being a failure with a few shining moments of autonomy. Dependence, thanks to our embodied nature, is the pattern of our life, and it what connects us to each other.
See, one of the wonderful things about that particular talk that led into this book, the entire conference, the theme was about dignity, and that book that of course shows up in the title of your book, The Dignity of Dependence. But one of the more brilliant things I heard, and I think this might go with, I think Eve Tushnet was putting this out, that dignity had not always been, as it were, a very Christian word. In the pagan world, it was especially sort of reserved for dignitaries, right? The idea was dignity is really something that the very special people have, and maybe you can attain it, but it's not really for anyone else. So there's almost sort of a carnivalesque inversion, right? When Nietzsche talks about the inversion of morals, Christians go, absolutely, we have now said the most dependent among us actually are dignitaries, right? And we see this in the broken body of our Lord, all the way to the ethical claims that we make now. Is that something that the dignity? Let's make sure that we don't too easily pass over that word, so that when we understand and talk about the dignity of dependence, maybe we understand the hard-fought way Christian ethics had to fight for that to even make sense in the world.
Well, I think the central Christian claim here that stands in contrast both to the old paganism and the new paganism is that dignity is something almost that you are, not something you attain. We are dignified creatures because we are made by a loving God in his image, above and before any dignity we attain through our own deeds or our own feats. But what you see today is the sense that our dignity is something we hold on to tenuously by our fingernails, something fragile, something we can lose easily. When you look at the states in America that allow euthanasia, doctor-assisted suicide, a couple of them keep stats on what led people to ask to be allowed to kill themselves in this medicalized way. And the most commonly cited reasons aren't reasons about the pain of their illness. It's the fear they've become undignified because of their bodily needs and that they are burdening their families. So here we have the sense of this very ordinary part of life that two things we're guaranteed are conception and dying are the only two parts of human life that every human experience is guaranteed. We look at one of them and say, well, this is a part that's kind of not fully human. The more you get close to dying, the less human you might become, and you might want to consider destroying yourself rather than become the kind of person who dies.
Your book, Leah, made me nostalgic for co-teaching with Bo. We taught a course on servant leadership, and we usually started with Aristotle and talking about human beings as rational animals, because a lot of our students didn't really come to the class with, a sort of philosophical grounding. So we wanted to talk some about what makes us distinct. And then later in the conversation, we'd bring in the great point from the late Alistair McIntyre about how we're dependent rational animals, and our dependency is something we can't completely avoid. Your book has an excellent discussion of all of this. And could you share with our listeners some about how our culture reinforces this lie of autonomy, and how a proper understanding of dependence kind of pushes back against that idea?
Yeah, I'll kind of highlight one big glaring way we do it and then a small everyday way, which is, a lot of our law talks about people as though they might be the kind of people who are autonomous or have a right to be autonomous, and anything that chips away at our autonomy is a threat that can be answered with violence. The case for abortion in America has often been framed through the idea that men are autonomous by default, and that women, unfairly, don't have the same ability to walk away and abandon someone who depends on them, who compromises their autonomy by existing. And therefore, women require the legal right to abortion to be able to match men, who a father can always abandon a child by simply walking away. It's cowardly, but it's doable. And a woman requires a medical intervention, a scalpel, a poison, or something else. And so in a very big way, we say autonomy is so important and so central to what a good human life means that it is acceptable to destroy, if not someone else, something else that could become a person to protect your own autonomy. That's the big scale way we say this is central. I think the small scale way is just in our ordinary lives. We avoid asking people for things. We try and patch up or make private our own neediness by turning to ways we can get help from strangers with money, which makes us equal because we're a customer then, not a suppliant. When you're sick, you might DoorDash a meal. You don't ask your friend to bring you soup by default. And then when we thank each other, we say, thank you so much. And often the response is, oh, it was no trouble. That's the polite way that you're kind of pushing away the thanks and saying, it was no trouble. It was a small thing. Oh, I don't want to burden you. Oh, of course you aren't burdening me. Not, you are burdening me, but I gladly take up this burden because I love you. So you get that big law thing, but that small catechesis of day-to-day reassurance. Of course this was small. Of course it's not burdensome. Of course what you asked of me wasn't very much for you to do. I was on my way. What does that communicate day by day? If it were large, it might be wrong to ask.
I mean, that is such a trenchant linguistic observation. You are channeling Wittgenstein in all of the ways. I mean that in an absolutely positive way. One of the things that I do with my kids is I tell them the reason I'm not going to lose weight is so my coffin's heavier and I'm a bigger burden on them so that I can help them get to heaven. They have mixed reviews about whether they think that's a good idea from their dad. But this idea, of course, of bodies taking space and, of course, having to navigate physical reality in which we will bump into each other. So I want to shout out a former student of mine, J.P. Plummer, who's in Human Factors, which is this sort of applied psychology of user interface, to be honest. And look, your first chapter is a brilliant argument about human factors and user interface and how it shows something about dependence that we can't get around even if we would like to, which is to say when you mass-produce products in a consumerist economy, you have to make up a fiction that by definition doesn't exist, which is the average human. The average human for which you'd make a car, make doors, et cetera, et cetera. But in a brilliantly scathing observation, you point out everybody assumes that a man is the average human precisely because of what you just said in the abortion debate. Men can walk away. Men are presumed autonomous, and so they need to be seen as average human for this mass marketing design. And anything else, right, where we start to talk about dependent humans, so like men included, old men, children, but as you said, particularly women, and women's prophetic nature to point out, because of how childbirth works, that there is a necessity in human life towards dependence, that there is no such thing as the average human, and our willingness to just avoid this and forget about this is one of the main causes where all of this, like you said, starts to stem from. We aren't interchangeable, not as individuals, but not as types of people either. So in that regard, do you mind like bringing into some of your fascinating, very hard data looking at arguments about presumed interchangeability that doesn't work and prove that we are actually dependent creatures?
Yes, I think there are two big themes of the book. One is just that we are dependent. And the other is, you might say, why you could just call it The Dignity of Dependence then. Why is this a feminist manifesto? This is the subtitle. And it's because the other big theme is that women's equality with men isn't premised on our interchangeability with men. And I think part of the reason that people get so interested in trying to assert this, that women either are interchangeable or can be rendered interchangeable with legalized abortion, with other accommodations, is because if you live in a secular, pluralistic society, it's hard to argue for the equal dignity of two not obviously the same things. You either have to find shared premises about, well, what gives people worth, or you can say, can we swap one for the other? Are they equivalent? If they're equivalent, then they're equal. And people kind of rely on that as their argument against sexism. Now, the danger of this is then it leaves you exposed. If there is a real durable difference between men and women, you may not be able to defend them as equal. And I think everyone knows there are real differences between men and women. Some of the more obvious ones are men are on average taller than women. Okay. And I think most folks can say that's true. And I think women can still vote. What was the reason? Because some women are taller than men. And they don't even say, yes, it's because there are overlapping bell curves. They just understand that difference doesn't impinge on women's basic equality. But then you get into, ones where there's a bigger difference, a stronger difference, or where there's an absolute difference. And pregnancy is one of those absolute differences where any man or woman may or may not themselves have a baby, but their lives are shaped by being the kind of person either who can engender a child, as the man does, or a person who can gestate a child, as the woman does. And whether you want a baby or not, your life is really shaped by in what way are you exposed to the risk of a child. Now, I'm still comfortable saying men and women are equal, but because I think they're different, meaningfully, unalterably different, I neither want to say women are basically defective men and we've got to do what we can to bring them up to standard. I want to say, what do we owe in justice to men and women in respect of their differences?
I appreciate the fact that in a feminist manifesto, you dedicate a chapter to talking about the calling to men, men into the breach. Could you share some about what you talk about in that chapter and how these differences that you have in view, so to speak, don't leave men off the hook? It calls us to certain kind of sacrifices in a way of being in the world.
Yeah, the reason I frame this first through women is because women are intimately exposed to dependence. Women can't pretend to be autonomous for very long. You can think for almost any kind of lie. And I think people do think this while they're telling one of how long can I keep this up without getting caught, right? And for women, the time between imagining or asserting you're autonomous versus getting caught is shorter than for men. Both people get caught out eventually, but men can keep the lie going a little longer. So I wanted to talk about what does this cost men and women to tell this lie? It costs them different things or at different times of their life. For women, again, that cost is direct, early, and intimate, that we're exposed to others' needs, and then the way that need changes us isn't accommodated. For men, it's a different cost. I would say it's both the fact that you can live within the lie for longer makes it harder to give up. There's a story I talk about that I read in the Times originally about a man who's a veteran, who's married, and his wife is in an assisted living home because she's gotten to the point where she needs round-the-clock care that he can't provide. And every day he goes out to visit her. And then one day there's a huge snowstorm and his driveway is totally blocked in. And he goes out and he digs and he digs and he digs until he's hurt his hands, but he can't clear the driveway by himself. And so he posts on his neighborhood Facebook that he needs help to shovel out so that he can go make sure he doesn't miss a single day with his wife. But the way he starts his message to his neighbors is, I am so ashamed. And then he says, but I can't do this by myself. And this is a man who's a profoundly generous guy. He's a veteran. He put his body on the line for his country. He puts himself on the line every day for his wife just to give her the gift of his presence. And he doesn't think, I assume, that when he visits his wife, he's condescending to her or humiliating her by helping her. But because he spent so much of his life thinking he is the person who is autonomous, who gives of himself to others, but doesn't receive in return, in this day when he needs help to love his wife, he's ashamed of it. He's humiliated by asking. I think that's often the challenge men face, both that they have trouble asking for help when they themselves need it, and therefore it's harder for them to live out the greatness of their love, and that they're not asked for help often enough because the people around them similarly feel slightly ashamed of their neediness. And then men have genuine strengths, genuine powers that women don't always have because they're touched in other ways by the needs of those around them, because they're bigger, because they're stronger. And instead of getting to put that to use, it feels like their talents are being buried by those around them. They're not needed. They feel superfluous. And we see that rise of loneliness and despair for men. We want need to be public and natural so that men can ask, but even more so that men can be asked.
Well, I found it really challenging. And this kind of gets back to your point about the language that we use when we help. But when you're talking about these neighborhood cooperatives and you say we have to shift from offering to asking, right? And so like we can maybe use like these message boards and say, I have this to give away. Does anyone need like something I'm going to throw out? And that's a start. But moving to this place where it's like we're not afraid to like have the courage to just have our vulnerability and need out there with our friends.
That's right. And part of why I advise people to, if you finish the book, if you pause partway through wanting to act on it already, is to start by asking for help rather than offering. Because I think when you start by offering, people are tempted to say no. When you offer, you put yourself in the position of power, of magnanimity. But when you start by asking, not only do you hopefully get help with something you genuinely need, you are catechizing your friend that you think it's okay to ask. And that then when they're in a moment when they need you, they go, Leah thinks it's fine to ask someone to watch her kids when, something has suddenly come up or her babysitter is canceled. So if I ask her whether she can do it or not, she will not be mad at me for asking.
Yeah. And I think that you end chapter 5, I believe, The Limits of Labor Language, with a sentence worthy to be a tattoo or a T-shirt. Vulnerability cannot be solved. It can only be shared. Vulnerability cannot be solved. It can only be shared. And not only is that just a wonderful quip to keep in mind, I think it's a wrapping up of precisely when we begin to think about labor and jobs and markets and pay, the sort of things that, when we negotiate, we go, well, there's this autonomous human, and I'm going to sort of like sweeten the deal enough for them to lend me part of their autonomy to get this thing that I want in the business or whatever. But to your point, there is absolute limits to all of that in everybody's life. And there's a way that women uniquely make this point, like you said earlier and more profoundly, as long as we don't have a society that, as it were, shoves that aside by insisting on the interchangeability myth.
That's right. I think we're often blessed by folks who are weaker or more exposed in a certain way in that they have to tell the truth about who they are. And because they are telling the truth, because they have no alternative, it gives us room to acknowledge it's true about the people who are stronger, richer, who can disguise who they are for longer. And as Christians, none of this should be a surprise. All of us are deeply dependent, even when we're, let's say, a well-off 35-year-old guy whose parents are in good health and who's planning to settle down at some point, but not yet, who has no one who's making claims on him. He is still, in that moment, deeply dependent on God, even while he's strong and he's young and he's healthy and he has no one who can interrupt him. He remains a created being, dependent on God for his creation, for his conservation in existence, and for his salvation. And it's our bodily needs that help us practice remembering who we are and not resenting who we are, so that we can receive God's much greater gifts with joy instead of shame.
Yeah, we're getting ready to get here to the end, so I don't want to launch off into the next big question. We'll save that for part 2. But I just want to reflect that I had the chance to answer a question for people who were studying the Creed, thinking about becoming Catholic, and they had a tough time understanding, like, what does it mean that someone is divine? What is a divine being opposed to us? And this was great. I was so glad they asked it, because it gets to the point you're getting at. The difference is not like super duper awesome, like whoever's at the top of the chain is divine and then the rest of us are maybe sort of kind of or not. It's the difference between the creator and the creature. And creatureliness is, by default, absolute dependence moment to moment. That's what the church is teaching, right? Is to exist in any way is already a dependence that is fundamental vulnerability. And to understand that is not this sort of terrifying existential dread. To understand this is to start to understand day-to-day, minute-to-minute existence as a gift. And if you can start to understand the gifted nature of just every second you're around, not just alive, around, and truly something, what starts to be ingrained in that message board ideal, like you're saying, that we don't offer but ask, is we have to ask for our existence every day. We don't, maybe not like by word, there's not a formula, but implied. And so if we have to ask and be thankful for our existence, what is it to ask someone to help us shovel the snow so we don't have a heart attack? But that's precisely where the sort of hubris, like you said, is a beacon that if we take time to look is really there and is asking us to think about this profoundly different. And your book, in so many ways, is great at pointing this out. We're talking with Leah Libresco Sargeant, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. So much more to talk about. Make sure to stick around. This is Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar on The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We get to do awesome things like speak with our good friend Leah Libresco Sargeant. The book is The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. She is an author, public intellectual, policy analyst. She's written all over the place. First Things America, The American Conservative, and her popular substack, Other Feminism. Leah, thanks for coming back on The Uncommon Good.
My pleasure.
So this brings up a lot of friction, and I love bringing up the word friction because, of course, there's a way, especially out of the gate, talking about the friction of the non-interchangeability between men's bodies and women's bodies, and there's already a friction that bodies cause. You have a short discussion, for instance, that talks about how women's cycles, just that reality, already pushes back, is a friction point, as it were, to what people want to make smooth and unencumbered so that the money keeps rolling. Where do you think some of these friction points are? And do you actually think the friction points are, in fact, a good if what you're arguing is indeed the case?
Yeah, there's a person I discuss in the book whose goal is to eliminate periods by default because women have natural cycles and there's kind of variation in when they have more energy or less energy or even just can go swimming or can't. It'd be better to get all girls on contraception early, not for safe sex, but in order to have periodless cycles. There's no skip period for the pill, just endless suppression of the period. Because it makes women different than men. It makes their lives more variable, higher highs, lower lows, and she thinks that's not worth it. And what I think is to have a society that's fair to women as they actually are, including natural cycles, including those highs and lows, you have to build a society that's amenable to a wider range of people, to people who are tired not because they're coming up on their period, but because they have a chronic disease, to people who have different needs. And in the disability community, people talk about this in terms of universal design. How do you design a process, a tool that can accommodate a wide range of capacities rather than designing a narrow tool and then only allowing in the people who fit the tool? I think it's a really helpful way to think.
You talk some in the book about the experience of labor. And as a father, I've been present for labor, but there's a way in your writing that you capture it really well. Late in the book, there's this quote from a novel, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And when a woman gives birth, she told him, death holds her hand for a little while. Sometimes he doesn't let go. And you write about this in the context of, the higher maternal mortality rate here in the U.S. But I thought it was interesting, like that phrase really kind of shook me in a way, thinking about women, like as they were preparing for labor and things. But you were saying like it's kind of reassuring in the sense that even if, like people say like, well, I wasn't good at labor, it was still something happening to you, like sort of stepping onto a roller coaster. And I found all of that section really compelling. Would you be willing to share more about like how even the experience of labor like influenced or augmented the way you think about being human?
Sure. This is part of where in the book I'm drawing that distinction between what are the most typically female ways of being exposed to need and the most typically male. And both men and women do a mix of both, but the prototypical female experience of putting your body on the line for someone is pregnancy and labor. And it's very particular, and this was reassuring to me, as you said, in that you are part of this process. You're doing it, but you can't stop. You don't moment to moment say, I am willing to go through this pain to have a baby. And now I am saying yes, so that the pain can happen. Luckily, from my point of view, it's happening either way. And you don't have to be afraid, am I brave enough for labor? Because it's irrelevant whether you are. The labor won't stop if you're not brave. And I felt very freed by that. But for my husband, who's standing right next to me for all of this and helping me, if he's frightened or overwhelmed, he can run at any moment. He's not tied to the mast the way I am. And so for him, the experience of putting your body on the line for someone, as he has done for me in each of my 3 labors, of holding me through contractions, of helping me, of praying as our baby was born, is a different kind of courage and a different kind of faithfulness. And it's the faithfulness of staying when you could run, or in some cases, choosing to run towards a hard thing. Now, women make that choice sometimes. Men sometimes are trapped in a hard experience they can only assent to, but can't stop either way. But I think it's helpful to think that there are different challenges or sacrifices we make in our lives that fall into each of those categories. Right. How are we prepared for each? How do we tell stories of heroism about each?
You know, anytime you're mentioning philosophers and specifically Socrates, I'm going to be interested, of course, but I think it's very apropos with what you just spoke of. So chapter 9, the school of love, what this is all leading towards, you point out that Socrates thinks philosophy is a preparation for death. But he also, of course, thought philosophy, what did he say a philosopher was? Well, a midwife, right? Like a midwife is the best way to describe a philosopher, always trying to help something to be born out of someone rather than, as it were, filling blank heads with thoughts. Mm-hmm. The reason I think this is important is a sort of the subsidiarity that you're talking about that isn't a sort of a libertine, we can all do things on our own, but that our dependence, when properly understood, is allowing, like you said, us to be a part of these grand things, but that they can't be taken from us just because they might be efficient. If there was some magic way to make labor completely and utterly mechanical, we would all, I think, well, not all of us, I should say, but I think rightfully the sort of philosophically habited of us would go, something would be missing. Not that women need to go through pain, but that certainly there's this very fundamental way where we go, how are we going to shepherd these things with each other, to make them come about? And that's, to me, why your book is eminently philosophical, not in the sense simply of you're stating philosophical positions, but I think you really do bring out for people what's at stake by the way that you bring up the examples that you do.
Thank you. And my goal is really, with the kinds of examples I use, that there will be ones where readers do recognize themselves and have had that exact experience, hopefully. And there will be a lot that are foreign to any reader, any particular reader, male or female, with the hope being that this book is in large way about how do we join up these experiences, see them as shared, not as a woman, I feel like my body fails me in this one particular way and I fall out of being fully human. But for a man, they have this different challenge and you have these private senses of failing to be a human, when in fact, these are all part of the full experience of human life.
Yeah, the whole trend towards like a denial of dependence sometimes feels very daunting to me. Like it's kind of this all-consuming way we structure the world. And the book gets into, I think, one of the great disruptors of this denial is children, and they place a claim on you that's really, for the most part, almost unavoidable, to the point where, I'll be honest, like sometimes I've almost felt kind of like sheepish about having my own children in certain spaces, like boarding a plane, and you sort of get this vibe that like you are sort of burdening people who are used to like not flying next to children. But the book, I started with daunting, and one thing that I love is like you have these sort of ideas about like practices, and I feel like as a writer you don't allow like the all-consuming nature of it just to overwhelm us. Other thoughts on how we live in the world and like the little practices we can put into place to sort of like resist this way of seeing things?
Yeah, a big one I think about, aside from just asking for help, is that when I'm together with a friend who is Christian, my goal is that I don't part from them without asking, what can I pray for you? And ideally, praying together. And the reason that's a big focus for me is it's often the case that I can spend a long time with someone, hang out for an hour and a half, talk about what we're thinking, what we're working on. And it's not till that last moment I say, what can I pray for you, that I find out that there are layoffs going on at their company, or that their dad is waiting to find out if he has prostate cancer, that there's this important thing they were carrying this whole time that never felt natural to bring up, in part because, well, what can Leah do about it? Am I just making her sad by telling her? But once you bring up the context of prayer, it's much clearer that we are always free to act and free to give a shape to our love for each other because we can pray together. And I think that's a way of opening that door. Well, can I ask for help? What if they say no? What if they can't help me? We know there is something that always can be done.
You know, Leah, you didn't pay me money to keep throwing out philosophers you're reminding me of, but this is a very Simone Weil point. She has that fabulous work where she says prayer is attention. And she, of course, is meaning this like with school studies. And she's saying, look, if you learn to study well, at the very least, you'll be able to learn that this act of attention can be used in prayer when you pay attention to God and the truth. But what she also points out fleetingly is what the poor need more than any one thing you give them is for you to attend to them. Your attention to those who are in need is the sort of existential thing that they need. And I think that that's another way, what comes to mind, right, is people acting like on the internet that when you say thoughts and prayers, that what you mean is you don't actually want to put your money where your mouth is. And certainly people do that as a rhetorical way to brush off doing something real. But Christians can't think that way. We have to think that prayer is an act, and it's an act of attending to the one who is destitute, the one who's suffering, the one who is in affliction, I think is what Simone Weil says. And if we would only do that well, I think that would be the sort of prophetic witness missing in the world, that they go, you know what? The one thing we can say about Christians is when they pray, they're truly doing an action, and it's an action of attention towards the one in need.
I don't know. I don't know how far you can get in endorsing prayer if you don't believe in God.
Oh, well, of course.
To say,
yes.
like, this is well-intentioned, they're bringing attention to someone, that all can be true, but it's not really enough to make it matter.
Oh, yeah. Well, and let me be very clear. What I mean is to say, if you talk about the witness of saying, do Christians live out what they say they're believing, that they believe in this God, I think when you say that prayer is an act of attention to those in need, I believe I can ask you and say, what do you need? And there's always something I can do, which is to pay attention to you in your need and bring that need before the Father. That would be a sort of witness that I think sometimes people who are dismissive of thoughts and prayers might find themselves surprised by. So, yes, belief in God, absolutely, and all of that besides. But I do think that that's very elemental that you're saying, that this is something we can all start doing tomorrow, is being intentional about asking, what can I pray for you about? Yeah, to keep moving along. So with other aspects of the book, one of the things that really struck me in the School of Love chapter is a harrowing find that you say that like archaeologists are able to point out, which is to say, oh, we discovered that there was a brothel like last night at a dig, and someone said, how do you know? And they said there's literally a pit of babies' bones, right? This brutal reality that with the sort of economicization of sexuality of women comes this brutal reality that the fossil record, as it were, has proof of, but then contrasting that with ancient archaeological finds that some of the earliest skeletons we have is quote-unquote able-bodied skeletons with ones profoundly disabled that had lived a long life. Why, with such a stark image, why do you find that as like one of the best ways, as it were, to really plant at the end of the book what you're getting at with this School of Love?
I think it's a way of remembering that the choices we make have real consequences today, and that they testify about us, not just moment by moment to God, but our children's children's children. Well, in the same way we read the Romans historical record and we recoil, or we read the record of these subsistence communities that barely had enough to feed themselves and let someone who could not walk grow to adulthood because they carried them, and we're moved by that. We are also leaving a record. We know what we admire in people who are far distant from us, but our record includes that there are missing people with Down syndrome, that when you go through the graves, you say, wow, at the time that Bo and Leah are talking, there are all these missing bodies of adults. And that's already written into our historical record, right? That will already be testifying against us for a certain point. But we get to decide today is how much longer will that testimony stand?
These seem like really important truths for our children to know. And like we've kind of been gesturing towards, like in our culture, there's this kind of formation that can take place that sort of denies the reality of dependence. As a parent, as a mother, like, have you found ways to sort of like guide your children into this, along to this path?
Yeah, it's funny. Some of it is talking about that my husband and I ask for help, that we can't do everything, which is a thing that kids believe of their parents. Letting them see that we're bad at some stuff, including I'm not a very good artist. And sometimes my kids ask me to draw things and they're mad that it's not very good.
I hear you.
And to say, there are things I don't know how to do that well. I'd have to practice. There are things that are hard for me to do because I'm not as strong as I'd like to be. And I either have to practice or I ask for help. But I try and talk very explicitly of, look what we can do because we have people to ask for help. Look how much larger our lives can be because we can ask other people for help, rather than look the small things we can do when we only do what we can do purely by our own efforts.
No, and I think that's a wonderful way to put it. I've heard someone say, if you really want to make sure a kid learns to read, it's good that you read to them. But the real way you get them to read is say, like, hey, don't bother me right now, I'm reading. And in a similar way, I think that's exactly what you're saying is to say, mom is on the couch resting because she is tired, or dad is waiting to finish this, whatever it is, until his friend comes over because he can't do it alone. That is a sort of fundamental reality that sort of stays in a kid's unconscious in a way better than saying, like, if you run into these problems, then do this. And I just see that so well put with some of the ways that you organize your argument. You talk about complementary fragilities, right? Not only between men and women or a husband and wife, but between communities. And I think that really lands with your entire chapter, The Blessings of Burdens, which is to say, there is no such thing as an untethered self, as you say. It's not a real self. But, to name burdens as blessings, to sort of start, as we're getting to the end of our time here, to turn back to that idea, to learn to say thank you for the burdens we share with each other, that is something that maybe doesn't feel natural in the way most of us talk in this world, but that I think you show in your book that there's natural ways that we can start doing this in little ways moving forward.
That's right. And I think part of this is expressing gratitude, not just shame or apology when we're asking for help. And the same when someone asks us, saying, I'm so glad you asked me. I'm glad I can be part of this hard time in your life. I'm sorry that it's hard, but I'm grateful that you trusted me with this. So it's clear that when these things happen, we want to know when our friends are suffering. We don't desire their suffering, but we're brought into their own circle of intimacy to know it, versus to be held apart as a stranger who doesn't see it and has no way to serve.
This is sort of an out of left field question, so feel free to punt or ask me to ask something different. But as you were writing the book, did this in any way sort of like change or influence your Marian devotion, or on the flip side, does Mary figure into sort of like how you think about these matters?
I think she really offers that testimony of receiving gratefully what is given to her, both the joy and the cross, and offering it all to God. And again, that's our reassurance that there's no period of our life, whether it's a period of profound capacity where we're pouring ourselves out for others, or a profound incapacity where we are receiving, where we don't feel like the authors of our life. None of those periods are a time when God is worried, will Leah be able to return my love? It's always a sufficient time to return the day he has given us in love and gratitude to him.
Right. That's really powerful. I know Bo's going to jump in here, but just real quick, like, I think providentially it's so significant that Mary accompanied our Lord all the way to the cross, so that even in the act of redemption, like, we have both elements there present.
Yeah, I was just going to say you guys are running laps around me in holiness because Bud was bringing up Mary, and I found the Wittgenstein quote that I'm glad that you gave. And look, it's elementally one of the best he ever did. We have got to slippery ice where there is no friction, and so in a certain sense the conditions are ideal, but also just because of that we are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction back to the rough ground. Again, tattoo, T-shirt worthy, mic drop quote by everyone's favorite Austrian. But I think what's interesting about that, you have books named after that, movements after that, but that rough ground, right, that it seems like you don't want there to be friction. But every year that I live life more is to try to tell someone who's asked me a question, my own children, students, that if you don't have that friction, it's going to be hard to literally move forward. That's what the analogy says. And in some ways, if you don't choose those frictions, you're just, as it were, kicking them down the line to where they're going to be obstacles rather than the sort of friction that you can, pull yourself forward. Do you feel that is some ways that when it comes to questions of like, okay, self-actualization and some of the things we do appreciate and want for our children, it seems, in modernity, the push against liquid modernity is to say, how are we intentional about naming the frictions that allow us to go forward in our life?
Yeah, I think people sometimes do this in long retrospect where they look back and say, this hard thing formed me or connected me to someone in this way I appreciated long afterwards, right? But I think it is important in the moment to be attentive to, I contrast as the idea of like, I really want to be free. I want to keep my options open. You can never just keep your options open. That's frictionlessness. To make a choice is to preclude other choices, but it's only by making the kind of choice that boxes out some other things that you get to make a big choice. And I think that's the kind of thing you can be grateful for even in the short term before all the sacrifices have stacked up.
Yeah. And I mean, it's harder to end on that. We got just a few minutes left. I want to make sure people know, like, this book, I charge thee, if you are listening, to go buy it immediately. But where can they go find out more about what you're doing? Like, maybe tell us about what the Substack Other Feminisms is about.
Yeah, one of the best places to find me is my Substack, which is Other Feminisms, with that S at the end. It's
nice.
a bigtent.com. And my real focus is on what does it mean to have a genuine feminism that advocates for women as women instead of treating us like defective men. Now, it's got a lively readership and commentariat, which includes men. It's not just for women, but I really like exploring these questions of how do we tell the truth about the human person?
Okay, but in 30 seconds, talk about your life as a fun debater and about like why Substack was a technology made just for you.
It's so great. It's a return to the golden age of blogging in a slightly different form. It lets people be playful with ideas, talk to each other, have a sustained conversation with a group of readers rather than a maelstrom of context-stripped tweets. And it's made it a lot easier to be encouraged for the long work of writing a book to have this continuing conversation with thoughtful people.
Absolutely. Well, look, one day we're going to have you either back on or just have a conversation with you about how all of this plays in the discussions about artificial intelligence in the digital world, something that really lays on my heart. And like Bud and I have talked a lot on this show, but I already see this right in the future when it comes to technologies that want to truly make us liquid and frictionless, but the way in which our infleshed, incarnate bodies stand in resistance. And it's just a timely book. I am so happy that you got it in print, and I want so many people to go out and get it. The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto by Leah Libresco, Sargeant. Leah, it's been an honor. Thanks for coming on The Uncommon Good.
Thank you so much.
Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Mara joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. But man, when you have someone like Leah Libresco Sargeant in her new book, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto, the time just roars right by. So much more we could talk about, but that just means people need to go buy the book.
Right. It's I really do encourage that. If you're thinking it's not one of those just dry treatments of a topic, there's so much there, like stories, examples. I don't know. It was an easy read for me in the best sense of the word.
Absolutely. Going from principles to practical applications, right, back and forth. Such a wonderful thing to do. She talked about the importance of prayer, so let's talk about that.
Please do join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We broadcast the Rosary at 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., later at 8:30 p.m. You can also pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:57, or if you're a really brave soul, wake up at 4 in the morning and do it. Send me a testimony. I'll shout you out on air. Finally, use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
And remember, folks, this ministry is not just the folks behind the mics, behind the boards, and behind the desk. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible by your prayers. We're talking about the importance of prayer. Your prayers make it possible, the volunteer hours, but very much also your material donations. You can go donate by calling 515-223-1150 during our business hours. Text 515-223-1150. Or you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and safely and securely hit the donate button there. Bud, as always, always. Wonderful to have you. Wonderful to do this. 9 years running. Fantastic stuff.
Thanks. Great conversation, Bo.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, city, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week. And just in case you get to hear this before the end of October, pray the rosary.